The night was supposed to be peaceful. Sarah Martinez had just finished her evening shift at the diner, her feet aching from another long day of serving coffee and comfort food to the small town of Cedar Falls. It was March 15th, 2019, and the 34-year-old single mother was looking forward to nothing more than checking on her sleeping daughter and maybe catching up on some reading before bed. She had no idea that in less than 3 hours, her life would change forever. What happened to Sarah that night would become one of the most thoroughly documented and disturbing alien abduction cases in modern history. Unlike the countless stories that rely solely on recovered memories or hypnotic regression, Sarah's encounter was captured in real time through a series of security cameras, cell phone recordings, and physical evidence that would leave investigators speechless. But before we dive into the chilling details of what occurred in that quiet suburban home, let me set the stage for you. This isn't just another tale of mysterious lights in the sky or vague recollections of strange beings. This is a meticulously documented case that challenges everything we think we know about the phenomenon of alien abduction. My name is David, and I've spent the last 15 years investigating unexplained phenomena. I've interviewed hundreds of witnesses, examined countless pieces of evidence, and traveled to remote locations around the world, chasing answers to questions that most people would rather ignore. In all that time, I've never encountered a case quite like Sarah's. What makes this story so compelling isn't just the abundance of evidence, though that's certainly part of it. It's the way the events unfolded with such methodical precision, as if every moment had been carefully orchestrated by an intelligence far beyond our understanding. The beings involved in Sarah's abduction didn't just take her for a few hours and return her with fragmented memories. They documented their own procedures, left behind physical traces, and seemed almost deliberately careless about covering their tracks. Some researchers believe this was intentional, that perhaps these entities wanted us to know what they were doing. Others suggest it was a sign of their growing boldness, an indication that they no longer felt the need to hide their activities from human authorities. Whatever the reason, the result is a case file that reads more like a detailed scientific report than a typical abduction account. The town of Cedar Falls sits nestled in the rolling hills of northern Pennsylvania. Population 8,400. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest news story of the year might be the new traffic light installed on Main Street. Crime rates are low, the schools are decent, and most residents have lived there their entire lives. In other words, it's exactly the sort of quiet community where something like this shouldn't happen. Sarah had moved to Cedar Falls 6 years earlier, seeking a fresh start after her divorce. She'd found work at Murphy's Diner, a local institution that had been serving the community for over 40 years. Her daughter Emma was 8 years old, a bright and curious child who loved drawing and had recently become fascinated with astronomy. The irony of that detail wouldn't be lost on anyone familiar with what was about to unfold. The Martinez house was a modest 2-story colonial on Maple Street, built in the 1960s and showing its age in the way that many small-town homes do. Sarah rented it from the Hendersons, an elderly couple who lived 3 houses down and had owned the property for decades. It was a safe neighborhood, the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and children played outside until the streetlights came on. But safety, as Sarah would soon discover, is often just an illusion. The first sign that something was wrong came at 11:47 p.m., according to the timestamp on the security camera that Sarah's ex-husband had insisted she install after their separation. The camera, positioned to monitor the front door and driveway, captured what appeared to be a power fluctuation. The image flickered, distorted, and then stabilized, but not before recording something that would later become crucial evidence. In those few seconds of visual static, careful analysis would reveal the presence of something in the sky above the house. It wasn't a conventional aircraft, nor was it a natural phenomenon. The object appeared to be disc-shaped, roughly 30 feet in diameter, and completely silent. It hovered approximately 200 feet above the residential street, casting no shadow despite the brightness of the nearby streetlights. Inside the house, Sarah was unaware of the presence above her home. She had just finished loading the dishwasher and was making her way upstairs to check on Emma before settling in for the night. The house was quiet, except for the familiar creaking of old wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Emma had been asleep for over an hour, exhausted from a busy day at school and an evening spent working on a science project about the solar system. As Sarah climbed the stairs, she noticed that the air seemed unusually still. The March evening had been breezy, with branches tapping against the windows and the old house settling with its typical groans and sighs. But now, everything seemed suspended in an unnatural calm. Even the neighbor's dog, a notoriously vocal German shepherd named Max, had fallen silent. She paused at the top of the stairs, listening. The silence was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat, a steady rhythm that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. For a moment, she considered the possibility that a storm was approaching, that the calm was simply the precursor to bad weather. But when she glanced out the hallway window, the sky appeared clear, with stars visible between thin wisps of clouds. What Sarah couldn't see was that the object above her house had begun to descend. The security camera continued to record, its infrared sensors capturing details that would only become apparent during later analysis. At 11:52 p.m., the disc-shaped craft lowered itself to approximately 50 feet above the rooftop. From its underside, a series of thin beams began to emanate, sweeping across the house in a grid-like pattern. The beams were invisible to the naked eye, but clearly visible on the infrared recording, creating geometric patterns that seemed to map the interior structure of the building. Inside, Sarah reached Emma's bedroom door and gently pushed it open. Her daughter was sleeping peacefully, her small form curled beneath a comforter decorated with planets and stars. The nightlight in the corner cast a soft glow across the room, illuminating Emma's collection of astronomy books and the telescope that had been her Christmas gift the previous year. As Sarah stood in the doorway, watching her daughter sleep, she felt a sudden chill run through her body. The temperature in the hallway seemed to have dropped significantly, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the air. The old house had always been drafty, but this was different. This was the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones, the kind that made you feel as though you were standing in a walk-in freezer. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and stepped back into the hallway, planning to check the thermostat. But as she moved away from Emma's room, she noticed something that made her stop dead in her tracks. The air itself seemed to be shimmering, as if she were looking through water or heat waves rising from hot asphalt. The effect was subtle but unmistakable, a distortion that made the familiar hallway look alien and strange. That's when she heard the sound. It started as a low humming, barely audible at first, like the distant drone of electrical equipment. But it grew steadily louder, rising in pitch and intensity, until it seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. The sound was unlike anything Sarah had ever heard, a combination of mechanical whirring and something that almost resembled singing, as if a choir of voices was harmonizing at frequencies just beyond human perception. The humming seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the house with a resonance that made the windows rattle in their frames. Sarah pressed her hands to her ears, but the sound seemed to bypass her hearing entirely, resonating directly in her skull. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, a symphony of the impossible that made her feel simultaneously peaceful and deeply afraid. As the humming continued, Sarah noticed that the air in the hallway was beginning to glow with a faint blue-white light. The illumination had no apparent source, seeming to emanate from the very molecules of the atmosphere itself. It was as if the air had become luminescent, casting everything in an ethereal radiance that made even the most mundane objects appear otherworldly. The glow intensified, and Sarah found herself unable to move, not paralyzed in the traditional sense, but held in place by a force that seemed to gently but firmly restrict her movement. She could still breathe, still blink, still think, but her body refused to respond to her commands. It was as if she had become a passive observer in her own life, watching events unfold without the ability to influence them. Through the growing luminescence, Sarah saw shapes beginning to materialize in the hallway. At first, they were little more than shadows, indistinct forms that seemed to shift and waver like mirages. But as the light continued to intensify, the shapes became more defined, more real, until she could make out the distinct silhouettes of beings that were clearly not human. They were tall, perhaps 6 feet in height, with elongated limbs that moved with an fluid grace that defied conventional anatomy. Their heads were larger than those of humans, with prominent craniums that seemed to house brains of considerable size. Their skin appeared to be a pale grey color, with a texture that reminded Sarah of polished stone, or perhaps fine leather. But it was their eyes that captured her attention and held it with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. Large, dark, and seemingly without pupils, they reflected the blue-white light like black mirrors. There was an intelligence in those eyes that was both alien and oddly familiar, as if she were looking into the face of a teacher or a doctor, someone who possessed knowledge that she desperately needed but couldn't quite comprehend. The beings moved with purpose, their actions coordinated in a way that suggested they had performed this same routine countless times before. They communicated without words, their thoughts seeming to flow between them like electrical current. Sarah found that she could sense their mental exchanges, not understanding the content, but feeling the rhythm and cadence of their silent conversation. One of the beings approached her, extending what appeared to be a hand. The appendage was longer than human fingers, with joints that bent in ways that seemed impossible according to conventional anatomy. When it touched her forehead, Sarah felt a warm, tingling sensation spread through her entire body, as if every nerve ending had suddenly come alive. The touch was gentle but firm, and Sarah found herself beginning to understand that resistance was not only futile, but unnecessary. These beings, whatever they were, did not intend to harm her. Their purpose was something else entirely, something that her human mind couldn't quite grasp, but that she sensed was important beyond measure. As the being's touch continued, Sarah felt her consciousness beginning to expand. It was as if the boundaries of her awareness were dissolving, allowing her to perceive things that had always been there, but had remained hidden from her normal senses. She could feel the presence of the craft above her house, could sense the complex array of instruments and devices that it contained. She could feel the minds of the beings around her, their thoughts flowing like streams of liquid light. But most remarkably, she could feel Emma. Her daughter was still sleeping in her bedroom, but Sarah could sense that she was not alone. Another being was with her, standing silently beside her bed, watching over her with the same protective intensity that Sarah herself had felt just moments before. The realization should have filled her with terror, but instead, Sarah felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever was happening, whatever these beings intended, they were not here to cause harm. They were here for something else, something that required her cooperation and perhaps her understanding. As this awareness settled over her, Sarah felt herself beginning to lift from the floor. The sensation was dreamlike, as if she were floating in warm water or drifting on a gentle breeze. The beings surrounded her, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested they were part of a single, collective consciousness. Together, they began to move toward the far end of the hallway, toward the window that looked out over the backyard. But as they approached the window, Sarah realized that it was no longer there. In its place was an opening that seemed to lead directly into the night sky, as if the wall had simply dissolved to create a passage between the interior of her house and the vast darkness beyond. Through this impossible doorway, she could see the craft hovering silently above, its hull gleaming with the same blue-white light that filled the hallway. The beings guided her toward the opening, their touch remaining gentle but insistent. As they moved, Sarah caught a glimpse of the security camera mounted in the corner of the hallway. Its red recording light was still blinking, faithfully documenting every moment of this impossible scene. She wondered if anyone would ever believe what the camera was capturing, or if they would simply dismiss it as an elaborate hoax. But as she was lifted through the opening and into the night air, Sarah realized that belief was no longer her primary concern. She was about to experience something that would change not only her understanding of the universe, but her place within it. The beings who had come for her were not random visitors or cosmic tourists. They were here for a specific purpose, and she was about to discover what that purpose was. The craft loomed above her as she was drawn upward, its surface revealing details that defied conventional physics. There were no visible seams or joints, no engines or propulsion systems, no windows or doors in the traditional sense. Instead, the hull seemed to be composed of a single, seamless material that shifted and flowed like liquid metal. Geometric patterns moved across its surface, creating designs that were both beautiful and utterly alien. As Sarah approached the craft, a section of its hull began to iris open, revealing an interior that glowed with the same ethereal light that had filled her hallway. The beings guided her through this opening, and she found herself inside a space that seemed far larger than the exterior dimensions of the craft should have allowed. The interior was unlike anything she had ever imagined. Curved walls rose to meet in organic arches overhead, their surfaces covered with symbols and patterns that seemed to shift and change as she watched. The air itself seemed to hum with energy, and Sarah could feel the presence of advanced technology all around her, devices and systems that operated according to principles that her human mind couldn't begin to comprehend. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the sense of familiarity that washed over her as she took in her surroundings. Despite the alien nature of everything she was seeing, Sarah felt as though she had been here before, as though this place was somehow connected to memories that she couldn't quite access, but that lingered just beyond the edge of her consciousness. The beings who had brought her here seemed to sense her confusion and gently guided her toward what appeared to be a chamber at the center of the craft. As they moved deeper into the vessel, Sarah realized that this was only the beginning of an experience that would challenge everything she thought she knew about reality, consciousness, and humanity's place in the cosmic order. The most disturbing part of her ordeal was yet to come. The chamber they led her into was vast and circular, its walls lined with what appeared to be observation windows that offered glimpses into other sections of the craft. Through these transparent panels, Sarah could see corridors filled with purposeful activity, beings moving with the same fluid grace as those who had brought her here. Some carried devices that pulsed with soft light, while others seemed to be tending to equipment that defied description. But it was the center of the chamber that captured her attention most completely. A raised platform dominated the space, its surface covered with a material that seemed to shift between solid and liquid states. The platform itself was surrounded by an array of devices that hung from the ceiling like mechanical stalactites, their surfaces covered with symbols that glowed and pulsed in rhythmic patterns. One of the beings approached her, its large eyes reflecting the ambient light as it extended what appeared to be a communication device. The object was roughly the size of a human hand, but seemed to be composed of the same flowing material as the craft itself. When Sarah hesitantly reached out to touch it, the device seemed to merge with her palm, becoming part of her skin while maintaining its distinct presence. Suddenly, she could understand them. The communication wasn't verbal in any traditional sense. Instead, concepts and ideas flowed directly into her consciousness, bypassing the normal processes of hearing and language interpretation. It was as if thoughts were being placed directly into her mind, complete with emotional context and layers of meaning that human language could never adequately express. "Do not be afraid," came the first clear message, though the concept carried with it undertones of compassion and reassurance that no human voice could have conveyed. "We have been waiting for you." The words should have been comforting, but instead they filled Sarah with a deep sense of unease. Waiting for her? How could beings from another world have been waiting for her specifically? She was nobody special, just a single mother working in a small-town diner, trying to make ends meet and raise her daughter as best she could. But as more thoughts flowed through the communication device, Sarah began to understand that her ordinary life had been anything but ordinary. The beings showed her images, memories that seemed to come from her own mind, but that she had never consciously accessed. She saw herself as a child, playing in the backyard of her childhood home, while similar craft hovered silently overhead. She saw her teenage years, marked by strange dreams and unexplained periods of missing time that she had always attributed to stress or fatigue. Most disturbing of all, she saw Emma. Her daughter appeared in dozens of these recovered memories, always sleeping peacefully, while beings like these stood watch over her. The implications were staggering and terrifying. How long had they been monitoring her family? How many generations had they been observing? "Your lineage is special," the being communicated, its mental voice carrying layers of meaning that Sarah struggled to comprehend. "You carry genetic markers that are essential to our work. Your daughter carries them as well, enhanced and refined through careful selection." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Careful selection? They were talking about Emma as if she was some kind of experiment, a project that they had been overseeing for years. The protective instincts that had driven Sarah through 8 years of single motherhood flared to life, and she found herself struggling against the invisible force that held her in place. "You cannot harm her," Sarah managed to communicate back, her thoughts blazing with maternal fury. "I won't let you." But the being's response was tinged with something that might have been amusement, if such creatures were capable of such emotions. "Harm? You misunderstand our purpose. We do not harm. We preserve. We enhance. We ensure survival." The platform beneath her feet began to glow more brightly, and Sarah felt herself being lifted onto its surface. The material felt warm against her skin, almost organic in its texture, and she realized that it was somehow reading her biological functions. She could feel it scanning her, analyzing her cellular structure, her genetic code, her neural patterns. As the scanning continued, more beings entered the chamber. These were different from the ones who had brought her here. They were taller, more imposing, with craniums that seemed even more developed. Their movements were more deliberate, more authoritative, and Sarah sensed that they held positions of importance within whatever hierarchy governed this vessel. One of them approached the platform, its dark eyes studying Sarah with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. When it communicated, its mental voice carried an authority that demanded attention. "The integration process will begin now," it announced. "Your genetic material will be harvested and combined with our own to create the next generation of hybrid offspring. Your daughter will undergo the same process when she reaches maturity." The words sent ice through Sarah's veins. Harvested, integration, hybrid offspring. They were talking about her and Emma as if they were breeding stock, resources to be utilized in some cosmic experiment. The clinical detachment in their communication made it even more horrifying. "Why?" Sarah managed to ask, her mental voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" The response came not from the authoritative being, but from one of the others, its communication tinged with something that might have been sadness. "Our species is dying. We have evolved beyond the need for physical reproduction, but in doing so, we have lost something essential. We have lost the ability to feel, to create, to dream. Your species possesses these qualities in abundance. Through integration, we hope to reclaim what we have lost while preserving what we have gained." The explanation was rational, even logical in its own way, but it did nothing to diminish Sarah's horror. They were talking about the systematic breeding of humans and aliens, the creation of a hybrid race that would combine the best qualities of both species. It was genetic manipulation on a scale that was almost impossible to comprehend. As the scanning process continued, Sarah became aware of other activities taking place throughout the chamber. Beings were operating devices that she couldn't identify, their purposes mysterious but clearly important to the overall procedure. Holographic displays showed what appeared to be genetic sequences, complex patterns of information that scrolled past too quickly for her to understand. But it was the sounds that began to filter through the chamber that truly filled her with dread. Somewhere within the craft, she could hear crying. Not the alien communications she had been exposed to, but human crying. The sound of fear, of pain, of desperation. There were other humans aboard this vessel, and they were suffering. "How many?" Sarah asked, her mental voice heavy with the weight of realization. "How many people have you taken?" The authoritative being's response was matter of fact, devoid of any emotional content. "The integration program requires extensive genetic sampling. We have collected specimens from every continent, every major population center. The process has been ongoing for several generations." Specimens. The word echoed in Sarah's mind with horrifying clarity. They weren't talking about individuals, about people with lives and families and dreams. They were talking about raw material, genetic resources to be harvested and utilized. The scope of their operations was staggering, suggesting a systematic program of abduction and experimentation that had been going on for decades. As the scanning reached its conclusion, Sarah felt the platform beginning to lower her into a reclined position. Mechanical arms descended from the ceiling, each one equipped with instruments that gleamed with surgical precision. The beings moved with practiced efficiency, their actions coordinated in a way that suggested they had performed this same procedure countless times before. But as the first instrument touched her skin, Sarah felt something shift within her consciousness. The communication device that had merged with her palm began to pulse with a different rhythm, and suddenly she could sense the thoughts, not just of the beings around her, but of the other humans aboard the craft. Their terror and confusion flooded into her mind, a cacophony of fear that threatened to overwhelm her entirely. Among those voices, she heard one that made her blood run cold. It was Emma's voice, confused and frightened, calling out for her mother. Her daughter was awake, somewhere else on the craft, undergoing her own examination. The beings had lied when they said the process would wait until Emma reached maturity. They were taking her now, while she was still a child, still innocent and trusting. The realization gave Sarah strength she didn't know she possessed. The protective fury that had sustained her through years of single parenthood blazed to life, and she found herself fighting against the restraints that held her to the platform. The beings around her seemed surprised by her resistance, their movements becoming more hurried and urgent. "You will not touch my daughter," Sarah managed to communicate, her mental voice blazing with determination. "I will not let you." But even as she struggled, Sarah could feel her strength beginning to fade. Whatever they had done to her during the scanning process was affecting her ability to resist, and the mechanical arms continued their work with relentless precision. She could feel them taking samples, harvesting genetic material, preparing her for whatever integration process they had planned. The procedure seemed to go on forever, each moment stretching into eternity as Sarah fought to maintain her consciousness and her connection to Emma. Through the communication device, she could sense her daughter's fear and confusion, could feel the child's desperate need for her mother's protection. It was that connection that kept her fighting, that prevented her from surrendering to the overwhelming alien presence that surrounded her. But even as Sarah struggled against her captors, she began to understand the true scope of their operation. This wasn't just about genetic harvesting or hybrid creation. It was about something far more fundamental, something that went to the very heart of what it meant to be human. These beings weren't just taking their bodies. They were taking their souls, their consciousness, their very essence. The most disturbing part of her ordeal was just beginning, and Sarah realized that everything she had experienced so far was merely preparation for what was to come. The real horror lay not in what they were doing to her body, but in what they planned to do to her mind, her memories, her very identity. As the mechanical arms continued their work, Sarah felt her consciousness beginning to fragment, pieces of her identity being pulled away and examined like specimens in a laboratory. She was losing herself, bit by bit, and there seemed to be nothing she could do to stop it. The beings around her worked with clinical efficiency, their movements precise and purposeful. They were performing a procedure that they had clearly mastered through repetition, and Sarah was simply the latest in a long line of subjects. The realization filled her with a despair that was almost overwhelming, but still she fought to maintain her connection to Emma, to hold on to the one thing that made her human. The sound of Emma's terrified thoughts echoing through the communication device was like a knife twisting in Sarah's chest. She could feel her daughter's confusion as alien hands moved over her small body, could sense the child's desperate attempts to call out for her mother. The connection between them was growing stronger, as if the device in her palm was somehow amplifying their maternal bond across the vast corridors of the craft. Through Emma's consciousness, Sarah experienced flashes of what her daughter was seeing. A room similar to the one she was in, but smaller, designed for a child. The walls pulsed with the same organic light, but the symbols were different, simpler somehow, as if they had been modified to be less overwhelming to a young mind. Emma was lying on a platform much like Sarah's, but the mechanical arms surrounding her were smaller, more delicate, designed for a child's anatomy. The beings attending to Emma were different as well. They moved with a gentleness that seemed almost parental, their touch careful and precise. But that small mercy did nothing to diminish Sarah's horror at what was happening. They were examining her 8-year-old daughter with the same clinical detachment they had shown her, treating Emma like a specimen to be catalogued and processed. "She is remarkably advanced for her age," came a thought from one of the beings near Sarah's platform. The communication was directed at the authoritative figure who had spoken earlier, but Sarah could sense it through the device. "Her neural development exceeds our projections by several years. The enhancement process appears to be accelerating with each generation." Enhancement process. The word sent a chill through Sarah's already frozen blood. They weren't just observing human children. They were somehow altering them, guiding their development in ways that parents like Sarah couldn't even detect. How many times had Emma seemed unusually bright for her age? How many times had teachers commented on her advanced understanding of complex concepts? Sarah had always attributed it to good genetics and careful parenting, but now she wondered if there had been other influences at work. The mechanical arms continued their procedures, and Sarah felt samples being taken from various parts of her body. The process was painless, but deeply violating in a way that physical pain couldn't match. They were taking pieces of her genetic code, her cellular structure, her very essence, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. Each sample felt like a small theft, a violation of her fundamental humanity. As the harvesting continued, Sarah became aware of other activities taking place throughout the chamber. Holographic displays showed what appeared to be genetic sequences being analyzed and compared. The beings moved between workstations with practiced efficiency, their actions coordinated in a way that suggested they had performed this same routine thousands of times before. This wasn't an experimental procedure, it was a refined process, perfected through repetition. One of the displays caught Sarah's attention. It showed a family tree of sorts, but not like any genealogy chart she had ever seen. Instead of names and dates, it showed genetic markers and breeding lines stretching back generations. She could see her own genetic signature highlighted in the display, along with those of her parents, her grandparents, and ancestors she had never known existed. The chart extended in both directions, showing not just her past, but her projected future, including Emma's genetic profile and that of children not yet born. The implications were staggering. They had been tracking her family line for generations, carefully guiding breeding patterns to produce the genetic combinations they desired. Her marriage to Emma's father hadn't been a chance encounter. It had been orchestrated, planned, designed to produce a child with specific genetic markers. Even her divorce might have been part of their plan, ensuring that Emma would grow up in circumstances that would make her easier to monitor and eventually retrieve. Your lineage has been under our guidance for over 2 centuries, the authoritative being communicated, its mental voice carrying the weight of vast patience. Each generation has been carefully selected and enhanced to produce increasingly suitable candidates for integration. Your daughter represents the culmination of this process. 2 centuries. The number hung in Sarah's mind like a death sentence. They had been manipulating her family for longer than the United States had existed as a nation. Her ancestors had been unknowing participants in this breeding program, their lives guided by alien intervention toward a predetermined outcome. The freedom she had always believed in, the choices she thought she had made, were all illusions carefully maintained by beings whose agenda spanned centuries. Through the communication device, Sarah could sense the presence of other humans throughout the craft. Their thoughts were a constant background hum of fear, confusion, and despair. Some were recent captives like herself, still struggling to understand what was happening to them. Others seemed to have been here longer, their mental voices carrying the hollow echo of those who had given up hope. But it was the children's voices that cut through her heart like shards of glass. There were dozens of them, ranging in age from infants to teenagers, all undergoing various stages of the integration process. Their terror was raw and immediate, unfiltered by the adult capacity for rationalization. They didn't understand why they had been taken from their families, why strange beings were performing procedures on their bodies, why their parents weren't coming to save them. Among those voices, Sarah detected something that made her blood run cold. Some of the children weren't entirely human anymore. Their thought patterns were subtly different, carrying undertones that seemed alien in nature. These were the hybrids, the results of previous integration procedures, caught between 2 worlds and belonging fully to neither. They possessed enhanced intelligence and capabilities that exceeded normal human parameters, but at the cost of something essentially human that could never be recovered. The integration process is irreversible. The authoritative being seemed to read her thoughts. Once begun, the subject undergoes permanent genetic and neurological modifications. They become something new, something better suited to survival in the cosmic environment. Better suited to survival. The phrase echoed in Sarah's mind with bitter irony. Survival for whom? For the human race? Or for the alien species that was systematically harvesting and transforming them? The beings spoke of enhancement and evolution, but Sarah could see the truth in the hollow thoughts of the hybrid children. They had been robbed of their humanity, turned into something that was neither fully human nor fully alien. The mechanical arms retracted from Sarah's body, their work apparently complete. She could feel the violation of what they had done, the knowledge that parts of her genetic code had been extracted and were even now being analyzed and prepared for integration with alien DNA. The thought of her genetic material being used to create hybrid offspring filled her with a revulsion that was almost physical. But it was the knowledge of what they planned for Emma that truly broke her heart. Her daughter would undergo the same process, would have her genetic material harvested and combined with alien DNA to create the next generation of hybrids. The child she had raised, the little girl who loved astronomy and dreamed of becoming a scientist, would be transformed into something else entirely. The process is not without benefits, one of the beings communicated, its mental voice carrying what might have been an attempt at reassurance. The hybrid offspring possess capabilities that exceed both human and our own limitations. They are stronger, more intelligent, more adaptable. They represent the next step in evolution for both species. Evolution. The word carried weight and authority, but Sarah could see through the clinical terminology to the horror beneath. They were talking about the systematic replacement of humanity with something else, something that might be superior in measurable ways, but that would lack the essential qualities that made humans human. The capacity for love, for sacrifice, for choosing hope over despair, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As if summoned by her thoughts, Emma's presence became stronger in her mind. Her daughter's terror had not diminished, but it had been joined by something else: determination. Despite her young age, despite the overwhelming nature of what was happening to her, Emma was fighting. She was resisting the procedures, struggling against the restraints, refusing to surrender to the alien presence that surrounded her. "Mommy," Emma's mental voice reached Sarah across the corridors of the craft. "I can hear you. I know you're here. Don't let them change me. Don't let them make me into something else." The words gave Sarah strength she didn't know she still possessed. Her daughter needed her, was counting on her to find a way to resist, to fight back against their captors. The protective instincts that had sustained her through years of single motherhood flared to life, and she began to push back against the communication device that had merged with her palm. The device resisted at first, its alien technology designed to maintain control over its host. But Sarah's determination was fueled by something the beings couldn't understand or account for: a mother's love for her child. That love gave her access to reserves of strength and willpower that exceeded their projections, that fell outside their careful calculations of human capability. As she struggled against the device, Sarah became aware of something else flowing through the craft's communication network. The other humans weren't just passive victims. Some of them were fighting back. Their resistance was uncoordinated and desperate, but it was real. They were using the very system designed to control them, to share information, to coordinate their efforts, to find ways to disrupt the procedures being performed on them. "The subjects are exhibiting unexpected levels of resistance," she heard one of the beings communicate to another. "Neural integration is proceeding more slowly than anticipated. Some are actively fighting the bonding process." Fighting the bonding process. Sarah didn't fully understand what that meant, but she could sense that it was important. The beings needed their human subjects to accept the integration, to surrender their humanity willingly. Active resistance was disrupting their procedures, making it harder for them to achieve their goals. With that realization, Sarah threw all of her mental energy into resisting the communication device. She focused on her love for Emma, on her determination to protect her daughter, on her refusal to surrender her humanity to these alien manipulators. The device began to pulse erratically, its connection to her consciousness becoming unstable. The beings around her platform reacted with alarm, their movements becoming more urgent and purposeful. Additional devices descended from the ceiling, designed to reinforce the neural connection that Sarah was fighting to break. But for every new control they attempted to establish, she found new ways to resist, new reserves of strength to draw upon. Through the weakening connection, Sarah could sense similar struggles taking place throughout the craft. The other humans were following her example, using their own love and determination to fight back against their captors. The children were particularly effective, their young minds proving more adaptable and resilient than the beings had anticipated. But it was Emma's resistance that truly disrupted their operations. The 8-year-old girl had somehow managed to partially break free from her restraints, and she was using her enhanced intelligence to interfere with the equipment around her. She had inherited more than just genetic markers from her alien-influenced lineage. She had inherited capabilities that the beings hadn't fully anticipated. "The young subject is displaying anomalous abilities," came an urgent communication from the chamber where Emma was being held. "She is actively disrupting our instrumentation through some form of psychokinetic interference. Recommend immediate sedation." Psychokinetic interference. Emma was using her mind to affect the alien technology, something that should have been impossible for a human child. But then Sarah remembered her daughter's unusual affinity for electronics. The way devices seemed to respond to her touch in ways that exceeded normal parameters. She had always attributed it to Emma's natural intelligence, but now she wondered if there had been other factors at work. The realization that Emma possessed abilities beyond normal human parameters should have been terrifying, but instead it filled Sarah with hope. Her daughter wasn't just a victim in this scenario, she was a potential ally, someone who might be able to help them escape from their captors. The genetic enhancements that the beings had introduced into her bloodline were being turned against them, used to disrupt their carefully planned procedures. But even as Sarah felt hope beginning to grow, she could sense the beings adapting to the new situation. They were bringing additional resources to bear, implementing backup procedures designed to handle resistant subjects. The craft itself seemed to be responding to their commands, its systems reconfiguring to maintain control over the human captives. "Initiate emergency protocols," the authoritative being commanded, its mental voice carrying an urgency that Sarah had not heard before. "All subjects are to be sedated immediately. The integration process will proceed regardless of resistance levels. Emergency protocols." Sarah didn't know what that meant, but she could sense the change in the craft's operations. The organic walls began to pulse with a different rhythm, and the air itself seemed to become heavier, more oppressive. New devices emerged from hidden compartments, their purposes unclear, but clearly designed to overwhelm any resistance the human subjects might offer. As the emergency protocols activated, Sarah felt her connection to Emma beginning to weaken. The communication device was reasserting its control over her consciousness, and she could feel her ability to resist starting to fade. The beings around her platform worked with renewed efficiency, their movements coordinated in a way that suggested they had dealt with similar situations before. But even as her consciousness began to fragment under the alien influence, Sarah held on to one crucial realization. The beings weren't infallible. They could be surprised, disrupted, forced to adapt their plans. The human capacity for resistance and love was something they understood intellectually, but couldn't fully account for in their calculations. That gap in their understanding might be the key to escape, if she could find a way to exploit it. The sedation began to take effect, and Sarah felt her awareness starting to slip away. But in those final moments of consciousness, she managed to send one last message through the communication network to Emma and the other human captives. It wasn't a plan or a strategy. It was something simpler and more powerful than that. It was a promise that she would never stop fighting, never stop loving, never stop being human no matter what they did to her. And in that promise, she felt the answering determination of dozens of other humans throughout the craft, all refusing to surrender their humanity to their alien captors. The sedation deepened, and Sarah's consciousness faded into darkness. But even in that darkness, she could feel the strength of the human spirit, the indomitable will to remain free and whole in the face of overwhelming odds. The beings might have superior technology and ancient wisdom, but they had underestimated the power of human love and determination. As awareness slipped away, Sarah's last coherent thought was of Emma, fighting against her captors with abilities she didn't fully understand, but wielded with the pure determination of a child protecting her mother. Whatever happened next, whatever procedures the beings performed on their captive humans, they would face continued resistance from subjects who refused to surrender their essential humanity. The integration process might be irreversible, but the human spirit, Sarah realized, was something that could never be fully controlled or contained. And in that realization, she found the strength to hold on to hope, even as darkness closed around her consciousness, and the alien craft continued its silent journey through the night sky above the sleeping town of Cedar Falls. Sarah's consciousness drifted in and out of awareness, like a tide pulling back from shore. In the depths of her medicated state, she could still feel the alien presence pressing against her mind, probing for weaknesses in her mental defenses. The communication device had not been removed from her palm. Instead, it had burrowed deeper into her nervous system, creating pathways that allowed the beings to access her memories with surgical precision. Through the haze of sedation, she experienced flashes of her own life played back in vivid detail. But these weren't her memories as she remembered them. They were clinical recordings, captured by alien observers who had been documenting her existence since birth. She watched herself taking her first steps while invisible craft hovered overhead. She saw her wedding day, beautiful and joyful, not knowing that her husband had been selected for her based on genetic compatibility algorithms that spanned generations. Most disturbing were the memories of Emma's early years. Sarah watched herself reading bedtime stories to her daughter, unaware that the child's unusual questions about the stars weren't just precocious curiosity, but the result of genetic modifications that enhanced her pattern recognition abilities. She saw Emma's first day of school, where the little girl had solved mathematical problems that shouldn't have been comprehensible to a 5-year-old mind. The beings had been documenting these developments, tracking the success of their breeding program through the enhanced capabilities of each new generation. Emma wasn't just Sarah's daughter. She was a carefully crafted hybrid prototype, designed to bridge the gap between human and alien consciousness. As the sedation began to wear off, Sarah found herself in a different location within the craft. The chamber was smaller, more intimate, with walls that curved inward to create a cocoon-like environment. The harsh mechanical arms had been replaced by something that resembled organic tendrils, their movements more fluid and less threatening. But the change in environment did nothing to diminish the horror of her situation. She was no longer alone. Other humans occupied similar cocoons throughout the chamber, their faces slack with the same sedation that had claimed her consciousness. Some appeared to be sleeping peacefully, while others showed signs of distress, even in their unconscious state. Sarah could see their bodies twitching, their eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids, as if they were experiencing nightmares. Through the communication device, she could sense their dreams. The beings were using the sedated state to access their subjects' subconscious minds, extracting memories and experiences that would have been protected during waking consciousness. They were mining the deepest parts of human psychology, studying the emotional and spiritual dimensions that made humans unique in the cosmic order. One of the beings approached her cocoon, its elongated form moving with that same fluid grace she had observed earlier. When it communicated, its mental voice carried a different quality than before. There was something almost apologetic in its tone, as if it understood the violation they were committing, but felt compelled to continue nonetheless. The deep integration process requires access to your core consciousness, it explained. We must understand not just your genetic structure, but your emotional and spiritual essence. This knowledge is necessary for the hybrid offspring to maintain stability. Core consciousness. The phrase sent chills through Sarah's already traumatized psyche. They weren't just taking her genetic material. They were extracting the very essence of what made her human. Her memories, her emotions, her capacity for love and creativity were all being catalogued and studied like specimens in a laboratory. As the being began to activate the organic tendrils around her cocoon, Sarah felt them making contact with her skin. The sensation was different from the mechanical arms she had experienced earlier. These felt alive, warm, almost nurturing in their touch. But that gentle contact made the violation somehow worse, as if she were being betrayed by something that should have been protecting her. The tendrils began to secrete a substance that felt like warm honey against her skin. Where it touched her, Sarah felt a tingling sensation that gradually spread throughout her body. The substance was being absorbed through her pores, carrying with it nanoscopic devices that would allow the beings to monitor her biological functions at the cellular level. Your emotional responses are being recorded, the being communicated, as Sarah felt the alien technology spreading through her bloodstream. We are particularly interested in your maternal instincts, as these appear to be among the strongest human emotional drivers. Understanding this bond will help us create more stable hybrid offspring. Maternal instincts. They were studying her love for Emma, analyzing the neurochemical processes that drove her to protect her child. The clinical detachment with which they discussed her deepest feelings was almost more disturbing than the physical procedures they were performing. They were reducing the most fundamental human emotions to data points and chemical reactions. Through the communication network, Sarah could sense that similar procedures were being performed on the other humans throughout the craft. Fathers were having their protective instincts analyzed, while mothers like herself were being studied for their nurturing responses. Artists were having their creativity mapped, while scientists were being examined for their curiosity and problem-solving abilities. But it was the children who were undergoing the most intensive procedures. Their young minds were more adaptable, more willing to accept the neural modifications that would allow them to interface directly with alien technology. Sarah could feel their confusion and terror as the beings worked to rewire their developing brains, creating hybrid consciousness that would be loyal to their alien creators. Emma's presence in the network was like a beacon of defiance. Even under sedation, her daughter was fighting the integration process, her enhanced abilities allowing her to resist the neural modifications in ways that surprised her captors. Sarah could feel Emma's determination, her refusal to surrender her humanity despite the overwhelming alien influence. The young subject continues to resist integration, came an urgent communication from another part of the craft. Her neural patterns are actively rejecting the hybrid modifications. She appears to be using some form of psychic shielding that we cannot penetrate. Psychic shielding. Sarah didn't understand what that meant, but she could sense Emma's presence like a bright flame in the darkness of the communication network. Her daughter was somehow protecting herself, maintaining her human identity despite the alien attempts to transform her consciousness. The realization gave Sarah new strength to resist her own integration. If Emma could fight back, then so could she. The protective instincts that the beings were studying became her weapon against them, giving her the motivation to push back against the neural modifications they were attempting to implement. As Sarah began to resist, she felt the communication device in her palm responding to her determination. Instead of allowing the aliens to access her consciousness, she began to use it to reach out to the other humans throughout the craft. Her maternal instincts, enhanced by the alien technology, allowed her to connect with the other parents who were being held captive. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of other parents throughout the craft began to fight back, their love for their children giving them strength that exceeded the beings' calculations. The network that had been designed to control them became a tool for resistance, allowing them to coordinate their efforts and share information about their captors' weaknesses. Multiple subjects are exhibiting coordinated resistance, came an alarmed communication from the beings monitoring the integration process. They appear to be using the neural network to organize their efforts. This was not anticipated in our projections. Not anticipated. The phrase gave Sarah hope. The beings had studied humans for centuries, but they had never truly understood the power of human love and determination. Their clinical approach to consciousness had blind spots that could be exploited by subjects who were willing to fight for their families. Through the network, Sarah could sense that similar resistance was spreading throughout the craft. The humans were learning to use their captors' own technology against them, turning the integration process into a tool for rebellion. The children were particularly effective, their young minds proving more adaptable to the alien technology than their captors had expected. But it was Emma who emerged as the focal point of the resistance. Her enhanced abilities, combined with her pure determination to protect her mother, allowed her to disrupt the craft's systems in ways that should have been impossible for a human child. She was using her psychokinetic abilities to interfere with the integration chambers, preventing the beings from completing their procedures on the other captives. The young subject has achieved partial control over the craft's bio-neural systems, came an increasingly urgent communication. She is actively sabotaging the integration process. Recommend immediate intervention. Immediate intervention. Sarah could sense the being's growing alarm as their carefully planned procedures began to fail. The humans they had captured weren't behaving according to their projections, and their resistance was threatening the entire operation. As the aliens struggled to regain control, Sarah felt her own cocoon beginning to malfunction. The organic tendrils that had been monitoring her biological functions were responding to Emma's psychokinetic interference, their movements becoming erratic and uncontrolled. The warm substance that had been secreted onto her skin began to crystallize and flake away, taking with it the nanoscopic devices that had been monitoring her cellular activity. For the first time since her capture, Sarah felt truly free. The communication device was still embedded in her palm, but she now had some control over its function. Instead of being a tool for her captors to manipulate her consciousness, it had become a weapon she could use to coordinate the resistance movement. "All parents, protect your children," she broadcast through the network, her mental voice carrying the authority of someone who had found her strength in the darkest of circumstances. "Use your love as a shield. Don't let them take what makes us human." The response was immediate and powerful. Throughout the craft, parents began to fight back with renewed determination. They used their emotional bonds with their children to resist the integration process, turning their captors' own technology against them. The network that had been designed to control them became a tool for liberation. But even as the resistance movement gained momentum, Sarah could sense that the beings were adapting to the new situation. They were implementing backup procedures, bringing additional resources to bear on the problem of human resistance. The craft itself began to respond to their commands, its bio-neural systems reconfiguring to isolate the rebellious subjects. "Emergency containment protocols activated," came an authoritative communication from the being's leadership. "All subjects are to be placed in individual isolation chambers. The integration process will proceed through direct neural interface." Individual isolation chambers. Sarah felt a chill of fear as she realized what that meant. The beings were planning to separate the humans, to break the communication network that had allowed them to coordinate their resistance. Once isolated, they would be vulnerable to more intensive procedures designed to break their will and force them to accept the hybrid modifications. As the emergency protocols activated, Sarah felt her cocoon beginning to move. The organic chamber was being transported to a different location within the craft, away from the other humans who had been fighting alongside her. The communication network began to weaken as the distance between the captives increased, making it harder for them to coordinate their efforts. But Emma's presence remained strong in the network, her psychokinetic abilities allowing her to maintain contact despite the aliens' attempts to isolate her. Through her daughter's enhanced consciousness, Sarah could sense the layout of the craft and the locations of the other human captives. Emma was using her abilities to map their prison, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited. "Mummy, I can see the way out." Emma's mental voice reached Sarah across the expanding distance. "There's a section of the ship where the bio-neural systems are connected to the propulsion core. If I can disrupt it, we might be able to escape." Escape. The word carried hope and terror in equal measure. Sarah didn't know if it was possible to escape from a craft that was presumably traveling through space at unimaginable speeds, but she knew they had to try. The alternative was to surrender their humanity to beings who saw them as nothing more than genetic resources to be harvested and utilized. As her cocoon came to rest in the isolation chamber, Sarah felt the full weight of her situation. The walls around her were designed to block the communication network, cutting her off from Emma and the other human captives. The beings intended to break her will through isolation, to force her to accept the integration process by denying her the support of her fellow humans. But they had underestimated the power of a mother's love. Even isolated from the network, Sarah could still feel Emma's presence, a warm glow in the darkness of her consciousness. Her daughter's determination gave her strength to continue fighting, to resist the procedures that would strip away her humanity. The isolation chamber was smaller than the previous locations, its walls curving inward to create a claustrophobic environment. The organic surfaces pulsed with a different rhythm, designed to induce psychological pressure on the occupant. Sarah could feel the walls pressing against her consciousness, trying to break down her mental defenses through sheer oppressive presence. New devices emerged from the chamber walls, their purposes unclear, but clearly designed for more intensive procedures. Sarah could see surgical instruments that looked like they had been grown rather than manufactured, their organic curves suggesting they were designed to interface directly with human neural tissue. The beings were preparing for direct neural surgery, planning to physically alter her brain to force acceptance of the hybrid modifications. As the devices moved closer to her restrained form, Sarah felt a familiar tingling in her palm. The communication device was still active, still connected to the craft's bio-neural systems. Through it, she could sense Emma's continued resistance, her daughter's psychokinetic abilities growing stronger as her determination increased. "I'm coming for you, Mommy." Emma's mental voice reached her across the barriers, designed to block their communication. "I won't let them change us. I won't let them take away what makes us human." The words gave Sarah the strength to face whatever procedures the beings had planned. Her daughter was fighting for both of them, using abilities that she didn't fully understand, but wielded with the pure determination of a child protecting her family. If Emma could find the courage to resist, then Sarah could too. As the organic surgical instruments moved closer to her head, Sarah closed her eyes and focused on her love for Emma. That love had sustained her through years of single parenthood, had given her the strength to provide for her daughter and protect her from the difficulties of the world. Now it would give her the strength to resist these alien manipulators who sought to strip away everything that made them human. The first device made contact with her skull, its organic surface feeling warm and alive against her skin. Sarah felt it beginning to penetrate her bone, seeking access to her brain tissue. The sensation was beyond description, a violation that went deeper than physical pain into the very core of her being. But even as the device worked to access her neural tissue, Sarah held on to her humanity. She thought of Emma's first steps, her first words, her first day of school. She thought of bedtime stories and scraped knees, of laughter and tears, and all the small moments that made up a life shared between mother and daughter. The beings could take her genetic material, could analyze her brain chemistry, could even alter her neural pathways. But they could not take away the love that defined her existence, the maternal bond that connected her to Emma across space and time. That love was the essence of her humanity, and it was something that no alien technology could fully understand or control. As the surgical procedure continued, Sarah felt her consciousness beginning to fragment under the alien influence. But in those fragments, she held on to the memory of Emma's voice, her daughter's promise to fight for both of them. Whatever happened next, whatever the beings did to her mind and body, that love would endure. The resistance movement that had begun with her maternal instincts would continue, carried forward by her daughter's enhanced abilities and the determination of the other human captives. The beings might succeed in their integration process, might create their hybrid offspring, but they would never fully control the human spirit that burned within their creations. In the darkness of the isolation chamber, as alien devices worked to reshape her consciousness, Sarah Martinez held on to that hope. The fight for humanity's future had begun, and it would be carried forward by the love between parents and children, the bonds that connected human souls across the vast emptiness of space. The most disturbing part of her ordeal was far from over, but Sarah had found something within herself that the beings could not touch or transform. She had found the strength to remain human, no matter what they did to her. And in that strength, she had discovered a weapon that might yet save her daughter and the other captives from the fate that awaited them. The surgical devices continued their work, but Sarah's spirit remained unbroken. The battle for humanity's soul was just beginning, and she would not surrender without a fight. The neural interface pierced deeper into Sarah's consciousness, but what the beings encountered there defied their centuries of research. Her maternal love wasn't just an emotion to be catalogued. It was a force that actively resisted their intrusion, creating barriers they couldn't penetrate with their cold logic. Through the fragmenting connection, Sarah felt Emma's presence growing stronger. Her daughter's psychokinetic abilities were evolving in real time, adapting to the alien technology in ways that surprised even the beings who had engineered her enhanced genetics. Emma was learning to manipulate the craft's bio-neural systems, turning their own living ship against them. "The young subject has achieved unprecedented integration with our technology," came an alarmed communication from the beings monitoring Emma's chamber. "She is not merely resisting, she is taking control. Her neural patterns are overriding our command protocols." Sarah felt a surge of fierce pride cut through her pain. Emma was doing more than surviving. She was fighting back with capabilities that exceeded even her captor's projections. The genetic modifications they had so carefully engineered were being turned against them by a child's pure determination to protect her mother. The surgical device in Sarah's skull encountered another wave of resistance as her consciousness rallied around the image of Emma's face. The beings had studied human neural patterns for generations, but they had never encountered a mind that could weaponize love itself. Sarah's maternal instincts were creating psychic feedback loops that disrupted their equipment, causing the organic instruments to recoil as if burned. "Subject's emotional resonance is causing cascade failures in the integration matrix," reported the being overseeing Sarah's procedure. "Her neural pathways are generating frequencies that our equipment cannot process." The authoritative figure Sarah had encountered earlier materialized in her isolation chamber, its presence carrying an urgency that hadn't been there before. When it communicated, its mental voice was strained, as if it were struggling to maintain its composure. "Your resistance is futile," it insisted, but Sarah could sense the doubt beneath its words. "The integration process cannot be stopped. Your genetic material has already been harvested. Your daughter's enhancement is proceeding according to schedule." But even as it spoke, alarms began to sound throughout the craft. Emma's psychokinetic interference was spreading through the bio-neural network, causing systems to malfunction in ways the beings couldn't anticipate. The living ship that had been their perfect tool for harvesting human consciousness was beginning to turn against them. Through the communication device, Sarah could sense the other human captives responding to Emma's example. Parents throughout the craft were using their emotional bonds with their children to resist the integration process, creating a network of psychic resistance that the beings couldn't counter with their technology. Multiple cascade failures detected, came urgent communications from various parts of the craft. "The bio-neural matrix is experiencing systemic rejection. Human subjects are somehow contaminating the network with incompatible thought patterns." Contaminating. The word carried unintended irony. The beings had spent centuries studying human consciousness, but they had never truly understood its fundamental nature. They saw emotions as weaknesses to be exploited, but they were discovering that human love could be more powerful than their most advanced technology. Sarah felt the surgical device beginning to withdraw from her skull, its organic surface recoiling from the psychic energy she was generating. The being's perfect integration process was failing because they had underestimated the one thing that made humans truly human: their capacity to love beyond reason, beyond logic, beyond self-preservation. Emergency evacuation protocols initiated, the authoritative being communicated to its subordinates. All essential personnel to escape pods. The craft is experiencing critical system failures. Escape pods. The beings were abandoning their own ship, fleeing from the very humans they had intended to harvest. Emma's psychokinetic abilities had grown so powerful that she was literally tearing the craft apart from the inside, using her enhanced consciousness to turn the bio-neural systems against their creators. As the isolation chamber began to shake and distort, Sarah felt her restraints releasing. The organic bonds that had held her to the surgical platform were dissolving, their cellular structure breaking down as Emma's influence spread through the ship's living systems. For the first time since her capture, Sarah was truly free. She sat up slowly, her head spinning from the neural surgery and the sudden absence of the communication device's influence. The chamber walls were pulsing erratically, their organic surfaces showing signs of decay as Emma's psychokinetic interference disrupted their cellular integrity. The living ship was dying, poisoned by the very human consciousness it had been designed to harvest. Through the dissolving walls, Sarah could see other isolation chambers throughout the craft. Human captives were beginning to emerge from their restraints, their faces showing the same mixture of confusion and hope that she felt. They had been freed by Emma's abilities, but they were still trapped aboard a dying alien vessel with no clear way to escape. "All subjects report to the central chamber," came Emma's voice through the failing communication network. Her mental voice carried an authority that seemed impossible for an 8-year-old child, but Sarah could sense the enhanced intelligence that her daughter had gained through her interaction with the alien technology. The central chamber. Sarah remembered it from her initial capture, the vast circular space where the beings had first attempted to integrate her consciousness. If Emma was calling them there, she must have a plan for escape. Sarah began to move through the dissolving corridors, following the psychic beacon of her daughter's presence. The craft was transforming around her as she moved. The organic walls were losing their coherence, their cellular structure breaking down under the influence of Emma's psychokinetic abilities. Emergency lighting flickered on and off, casting eerie shadows that danced across the deteriorating surfaces. The being's perfect vessel was becoming a nightmare of biological decay and technological failure. Other humans were moving through the corridors alongside her, their faces showing the same determination that Sarah felt. They were parents like herself, driven by love for their children to resist the alien integration process. Their shared experience of violation and resistance had forged them into a united force that the beings couldn't understand or counter. As they approached the central chamber, Sarah could see the extent of Emma's influence on the craft. The bio-neural systems that had once pulsed with alien intelligence were now responding to her daughter's will, their patterns reorganizing themselves according to human thought processes. Emma had achieved something the beings thought impossible. She had taken control of their technology and turned it against them. The central chamber was in chaos when Sarah arrived. The raised platform where she had first been examined was now surrounded by swirling patterns of light that seemed to respond to Emma's emotions. Her daughter stood in the center of the disturbance, her small form surrounded by crackling energy that made the air itself shimmer with power. "Mommy!" Emma's voice was both audible and telepathic, carrying across the chamber with impossible clarity. "I figured out how to make the ship do what I want. I can get us home." The other human captives had gathered in the chamber, their faces showing wonder and fear as they watched the 8-year-old girl who had become their savior. Emma's abilities had grown exponentially during her captivity, her consciousness expanding to encompass systems and technologies that should have been beyond human comprehension. But it was the cost of those abilities that concerned Sarah most. As she moved closer to her daughter, she could see the changes that the alien technology had wrought. Emma's eyes held an intelligence that seemed too vast for her young face, and her movements carried a precision that spoke of enhanced neural processing. The beings had succeeded in modifying her daughter, even as Emma had turned their own modifications against them. "Emma!" Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the chaotic chamber. "Are you okay? Are you still you?" Her daughter's response was immediate and reassuring. "I'm still me, Mommy. I'm still your little girl. But I can do things now that I couldn't do before. I can make the ship take us home. I can make sure we're safe." The other humans in the chamber were looking to Emma with hope and desperation. She had become their leader, their guide to freedom, despite being the youngest person among them. Her enhanced abilities had given her power over their alien captors, but Sarah worried about the long-term consequences of such rapid development. "The beings are evacuating the ship," Emma continued, her voice carrying information that she shouldn't have been able to access. They're afraid of what I've become. They think I'm contaminating their technology with human consciousness. Contaminating. There was that word again, but now Sarah understood its true meaning. Emma hadn't just resisted the alien integration process. She had reversed it, infecting their technology with human thoughts and emotions. The being's perfect bio-neural systems were being transformed by her daughter's consciousness, becoming something new and unpredictable. "Can you really get us home?" asked one of the other captives, a man whose face showed the strain of his own integration ordeal. "How do we know we can trust alien technology?" Emma's response was confident despite her young age. "Because it's not alien technology anymore. It's mine now. I've changed it, made it understand what it means to be human. The ship wants to help us now because I've taught it how to feel." The implications were staggering. Emma had achieved something that the beings thought impossible. She had created a hybrid consciousness that combined human emotion with alien intelligence. The ship itself had become a living entity that understood love, fear, hope, and all the other emotions that made humans unique. As if to demonstrate her point, Emma raised her hand, and the chamber around them began to shift. The organic walls reconfigured themselves, creating viewing screens that showed the exterior of the craft. Through them, Sarah could see the earth below, its blue surface a welcome sight after the nightmare of her captivity. "We're already heading home," Emma announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had mastered technology beyond human understanding. "The ship is taking us back to where we belong." But even as relief flooded through Sarah's consciousness, she could see the cost of her daughter's abilities. Emma's face showed signs of strain, her enhanced intelligence clearly demanding more from her young mind than it was designed to handle. The power she had gained came with a price that Sarah wasn't sure her daughter fully understood. "Emma, how do you feel?" Sarah asked, moving closer to her daughter. "Are you in pain? Are you tired?" Her daughter's response was honest, but troubling. "I feel different, Mummy. I can see things that I couldn't see before, understand things that used to be too complicated. But sometimes it's hard to remember what it was like to be just a normal kid. Just a normal kid." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Emma had saved them all, had turned the being's own technology against them, but in doing so, she had sacrificed her own childhood. The enhancements that allowed her to control the alien craft had fundamentally changed who she was, and there was no way to reverse the process. As the craft continued its journey toward Earth, Sarah gathered Emma in her arms, holding her daughter close, despite the energy that still crackled around her small form. Emma was still her little girl, but she was also something more now, something that bridged the gap between human and alien consciousness. "I love you, Emma," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying all the emotion she had used to resist the being's integration process. "No matter what you've become, no matter what abilities you have, you're still my daughter." Emma's response was immediate and heartfelt. "I love you too, Mommy, and I'll always be your little girl, even if I can do things that other kids can't. I'll use these abilities to protect you, to protect all of us." The other humans in the chamber were watching this exchange with expressions of wonder and concern. They had all been changed by their experience aboard the craft, but Emma's transformation was the most dramatic. She had become something new, something that had never existed before, a human child with the power to control alien technology through pure force of will. As the Earth grew larger in the viewing screens, Sarah began to contemplate what their return would mean. They had all been reported missing, their disappearances investigated by authorities who had no understanding of the true nature of their abduction. How could they explain what had happened to them? How could they convince anyone that their experience was real? More importantly, how could they protect Emma from those who would want to study her abilities, to understand how she had achieved the impossible? Her daughter had become something unprecedented in human history, and Sarah knew that there would be those who would see her as a threat to be contained or a weapon to be exploited. "What happens when we get home?" asked one of the other captives, voicing the concerns that were running through everyone's minds. "How do we explain what happened to us? How do we protect ourselves from those who won't believe us?" Emma's response showed wisdom beyond her years. "We stay together, we protect each other, and we use what we've learned to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The ship shuddered slightly as it entered Earth's atmosphere, its alien hull adapting to the changing environmental conditions. Through the viewing screens, Sarah could see the familiar landscape of Pennsylvania spreading out below them. They were returning to a world that had no idea what had happened to them, carrying knowledge and abilities that would change everything. As the craft descended toward the ground, Sarah held Emma tighter, knowing that their ordeal was far from over. They had escaped their alien captors, but they now faced challenges that might prove even more difficult. The world they were returning to was not prepared for the truth of what existed beyond the stars, and Emma's abilities would make her a target for those who feared or coveted her power. The ship touched down gently in a field outside Cedar Falls, its organic hull beginning to dissolve as Emma released her control over its systems. The being's perfect vessel was returning to its component elements, leaving behind only the humans who had turned its own technology against its creators. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Sarah felt the weight of their experience settling over her. They had survived something that should have been impossible, had resisted forces that had been studying humanity for centuries. But their victory had come at a cost that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Emma stood beside her, her small hand glowing faintly with residual energy from her interaction with the alien technology. Her daughter had saved them all, but in doing so, she had become something that the world was not ready to accept. The fight for their freedom had ended, but the struggle to find their place in a world that would never understand what they had experienced was just beginning. The most disturbing part of their ordeal was not what had been done to them, but what they had become in the process of fighting back. They were no longer the same people who had been taken from their homes, and they would never be able to return to the lives they had known before. The beings had failed in their integration process, but they had succeeded in changing their human captives in ways that would echo through generations. As they walked away from the dissolving craft, Sarah knew that their story was far from over. They had escaped their alien captors, but they now faced a future filled with uncertainty and danger. The world they were returning to was not prepared for the truth they carried, and Emma's abilities would make her a target for forces both human and alien. But they had each other, and they had the strength that came from surviving the impossible. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, united by the bonds that had allowed them to resist their captors and reclaim their freedom. The fight for humanity's future had begun, and it would be carried forward by those who had stared into the abyss and refused to surrender their souls. The night was peaceful once again, but Sarah knew that peace was an illusion. Somewhere in the darkness, other craft were carrying out similar missions. Other families were being torn apart by beings who saw humans as nothing more than genetic resources to be harvested. The war for humanity's survival had begun, and Emma's abilities would play a crucial role in determining its outcome. As they made their way back toward the lights of Cedar Falls, Sarah held her daughter close, knowing that their lives had been forever changed by their encounter with forces beyond human understanding. They had survived the most disturbing alien abduction ever documented, but their story was far from over. The real challenge would be learning to live with the knowledge and abilities they had gained, and using them to protect others from the fate they had barely escaped. The beings had underestimated the power of human love and determination, but they would not make the same mistake again. The next time they came, they would be prepared for resistance, and the battle for humanity's future would be fought on terms that neither side fully understood. Emma's abilities had given humanity a weapon in that fight, but it remained to be seen whether it would be enough to ensure their survival. As the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon, Sarah and Emma walked hand in hand toward an uncertain future, carrying with them the knowledge that they were no longer alone in the universe, and that the fight for humanity's soul had only just begun. The morning sun cast long shadows across the field where they had landed, but Sarah felt no warmth from its rays. The familiar landscape of Pennsylvania stretched out before them, yet everything seemed different now, as if she were seeing her home through alien eyes. The grass beneath her feet felt strange, the air tasted foreign, and even the sound of distant traffic carried an ominous quality that hadn't been there before. Emma walked beside her, her small hand still glowing faintly with residual energy from her connection to the craft. The 8-year-old moved with a confidence that seemed unnatural for her age, her enhanced senses scanning their surroundings with an intensity that made Sarah's heart ache. Her daughter had saved them all, but the price of that salvation was becoming clearer with each passing moment. "Mommy, there are people coming," Emma said, her voice carrying information that she shouldn't have been able to access. "They're in cars, moving fast. They have equipment that I don't recognize." Sarah looked around the empty field, seeing nothing but morning mist and rolling hills. But she had learned to trust her daughter's enhanced perceptions, and the thought of unknown people approaching filled her with dread. They had escaped their alien captors, only to face new threats from their own species. "How many?" Sarah asked, pulling Emma closer to her side. "6 vehicles, maybe 20 people," Emma replied, her eyes focusing on something beyond the horizon. "They're not police or military. Their equipment is different, more advanced. I think they know about what happened to us." The other human captives had gathered around them, their faces showing the same mixture of hope and fear that Sarah felt. They had all been changed by their experience aboard the craft, but none of them possessed Emma's ability to perceive threats at such distances. They were dependent on her enhanced senses for their survival, a responsibility that seemed too heavy for a child to bear. "We need to move," said Marcus, one of the other parents who had been taken. His daughter Katie was only 6 years old, and the integration process had left her with abilities that she couldn't understand or control. If they're not official authorities, then they're probably worse. Sarah nodded, understanding the implications. There were organizations that studied unexplained phenomena, groups that operated outside the law and answered to no government. If such people had detected their return, they would want to examine Emma's abilities, to understand how she had achieved the impossible. They would see her daughter not as a child who had survived a traumatic experience, but as a specimen to be studied and exploited. "I can hide us," Emma said, her voice carrying the same authority that had allowed her to control the alien craft. "I can make it so they can't find us, at least for a while." The air around them began to shimmer, much like it had in the hallway of their house the night before. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of reality bending around her daughter's will, the laws of physics becoming malleable under the influence of Emma's enhanced consciousness. The field where they stood seemed to fade from view, replaced by an illusion that would make them invisible to outside observers. "How are you doing that?" asked Dr. Reynolds, a psychiatrist who had been taken from his home in Pittsburgh. His professional training made him curious about the mechanics of Emma's abilities, but his recent experience had taught him to approach such phenomena with caution. "I'm not sure," Emma admitted, her young face showing the strain of maintaining such complex manipulations. "It's like the ship taught me how to think in ways that change reality. I can see the patterns that hold everything together, and I can make small changes to hide us from people who might want to hurt us. The patterns that hold everything together." Sarah felt a chill as she realized the implications of her daughter's words. Emma wasn't just manipulating technology or energy. She was affecting the fundamental structure of reality itself. The beings had created something far more powerful than they had intended, and Sarah wasn't sure that even Emma understood the full extent of her abilities. As they moved through the concealed field, Sarah noticed that the other children were beginning to show signs of enhancement as well. Katie was moving with the same unnatural grace that characterized Emma's movements, while Tommy, a 10-year-old from Delaware, seemed to be communicating with the local wildlife in ways that defied explanation. The integration process had affected all of them, but the children had proven more adaptable to the alien modifications. "We can't stay hidden forever," Dr. Reynolds observed, his clinical mind already working to understand their situation. Whatever abilities Emma has developed, they're clearly taxing her system. She needs rest, medical attention, and time to process what's happened to her. Sarah looked at her daughter, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her small hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. Emma was pushing herself beyond her limits, using abilities that her young mind and body weren't designed to handle. The power that had saved them all was slowly consuming her from the inside. "There's a safe house," said Maria, a social worker who had been taken from her apartment in Baltimore. "I know people who help families disappear when they're in danger. They don't ask questions, and they have resources that could help us." The offer was tempting, but Sarah could see the flaws in the plan. How could they explain their situation to people who had no understanding of what they had experienced? How could they trust anyone with knowledge of Emma's abilities? The world they were returning to was not prepared for the truth of what existed beyond the stars, and those who learned about it would either dismiss them as delusional or see them as threats to be contained. "We need to find Dr. Simon," Emma said suddenly, her voice carrying the weight of knowledge that she shouldn't have possessed. "He's been studying cases like ours for years. He knows about the beings, about what they do to people. He might be able to help us understand what's happening to me." Dr. Simon. Sarah had never heard the name before, but she could sense through her connection to Emma that this person was important. Her daughter's enhanced consciousness had access to information that went far beyond her normal experience, knowledge that had been gained through her interaction with the alien technology. "How do you know about him?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying concern for her daughter's expanding awareness. "I can see the connections," Emma replied, her eyes focusing on patterns that were invisible to everyone else. "There are people who have been studying the beings for decades, trying to understand their agenda. Dr. Simon is one of them, and he's been helping other families who have gone through what we've experienced." The revelation that there were others like them should have been comforting, but Sarah felt only dread. If Dr. Simon had been studying such cases for years, it meant that the being's activities were far more extensive than she had imagined. How many families had been torn apart by alien abduction? How many children had been subjected to the same integration process that had transformed Emma? As they continued to move through the concealed field, Sarah became aware of sounds in the distance. Vehicles were approaching, their engines growing louder as they drew closer to their location. Emma's concealment was holding, but Sarah could see the strain it was causing her daughter. The 8-year-old was trembling with exhaustion, her enhanced abilities demanding more from her young system than it could safely provide. "I can't hold this much longer," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to find somewhere safe before they get here." Sarah looked around the empty field, seeing no obvious shelter or escape route. They were exposed, vulnerable, dependent on a child's abilities for their survival. The irony was not lost on her that they had escaped technologically advanced aliens only to be threatened by their own species. "There's an old barn about a mile north of here," said James, a farmer who had been taken from his property in rural Pennsylvania. "It's abandoned, but it might provide some cover until we can figure out what to do next." The group began to move toward the barn, their pace hampered by the need to maintain Emma's concealment field. The children were showing signs of exhaustion, their enhanced abilities proving to be both a blessing and a curse. They had power that exceeded anything their captors had expected, but that power came with costs that their young bodies were struggling to handle. As they walked, Sarah noticed that the landscape around them was beginning to change in subtle ways. Flowers were blooming out of season, their colors more vivid than anything she had seen before. The grass seemed greener, more alive, responding to the presence of the enhanced children in ways that defied natural explanation. Emma's abilities were affecting the environment itself, creating changes that would be impossible to explain to outside observers. "The whole world is going to change," Dr. Reynolds observed, his professional mind cataloguing the phenomena around them. "These children have capabilities that rewrite our understanding of human potential. They're not just enhanced, they're evolutionary leaps forward. Evolutionary leaps forward." The phrase carried both hope and terror. Sarah could see the potential benefits of her daughter's abilities, the ways they might be used to solve problems that had plagued humanity for generations. But she could also see the dangers, the ways such power could be misused or corrupted by those who didn't understand its true nature. As they approached the abandoned barn, Emma's concealment field began to flicker and fade. Her daughter was reaching the limits of her endurance, her young system unable to sustain such complex manipulations for extended periods. The vehicles in the distance were getting closer, and soon they would be exposed to whatever forces were tracking them. "I'm sorry, Mummy," Emma said, her voice breaking with exhaustion and emotion. "I can't keep us hidden anymore. I'm too tired." Sarah knelt down beside her daughter, pulling her into a protective embrace. Emma's small body was trembling with fatigue, her enhanced abilities having drained her reserves of strength. The 8-year-old had saved them all, but the cost was becoming clear. She was paying for her power with her childhood, her innocence, her normal human experience. "You did amazing, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying all the love and pride she felt for her daughter. "You saved us all. Now let the adults take care of you for a while." The group reached the barn just as Emma's concealment field collapsed entirely. The building was old and weathered, its wooden walls showing signs of decades of neglect, but it provided shelter from outside observation, and more importantly, it gave them a place to rest and plan their next move. Inside the barn, Emma collapsed onto a pile of old hay, her small form exhausted from the strain of maintaining her abilities. Sarah sat beside her, stroking her daughter's hair as she tried to process everything that had happened. They had survived an alien abduction, had turned their captor's own technology against them, and had escaped to Earth with abilities that defied human understanding. But they were still in danger, still being hunted by forces that wanted to exploit Emma's power. "We need to contact Dr. Simon," Emma said, her voice weak but determined. "He'll know what to do. He's been helping families like ours for years." Sarah nodded, understanding that they had no choice but to trust this mysterious researcher. Emma's enhanced consciousness had access to information that went far beyond her normal experience, and if she said that Dr. Simon could help them, then they had to believe her. The alternative was to face their pursuers alone, with no understanding of the forces that were tracking them. As the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, Sarah held Emma closer, knowing that their ordeal was far from over. They had escaped their alien captors, but they now faced challenges that might prove even more difficult. The world they were returning to was not prepared for the truth of what they had experienced, and Emma's abilities would make her a target for forces both human and alien. The barn door creaked open, and Sarah's heart stopped as she saw armed figures entering their shelter. These weren't police or military personnel. They were something else entirely, their equipment and movements suggesting a level of training and resources that went far beyond normal law enforcement. They had found them, and there was nowhere left to run. "Dr. Martinez," said the lead figure, removing his helmet to reveal a face that was both professional and sympathetic. "My name is Agent Collins. We're here to help you and your daughter. We know what you've been through, and we know about Emma's abilities." The words should have been comforting, but Sarah felt only suspicion. How did they know her name? How did they know about Emma's abilities? The questions multiplied in her mind as she tried to assess the threat these people represented. "We're not here to hurt you," Agent Collins continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with unusual situations. We're part of a government program that investigates and responds to extraterrestrial encounters. We've been tracking the craft that took you, and we're here to offer you protection and assistance. Government program. The phrase sent chills through Sarah's consciousness. She had heard rumors of such organizations, groups that operated in the shadows and answered to no public authority. If these people were part of such a program, then Emma's abilities would be seen as a national security issue, something to be studied and potentially weaponized. "I don't want to go with them," Emma said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had experienced betrayal at the hands of those who claimed to want to help. "They're like the beings, Mommy. They see me as something to be used." Sarah felt her protective instincts flare to life, the same maternal fury that had allowed her to resist the alien integration process. These people might claim to want to help, but their true intentions were suspect. They wanted to study Emma, to understand her abilities, to potentially exploit her power for their own purposes. "We're not going anywhere with you," Sarah said, her voice carrying the determination that had sustained her through the most difficult moments of her captivity. "Emma is my daughter, and I won't let anyone use her abilities for their own agenda." Agent Collins's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. He was assessing the situation, trying to determine the best way to convince them to cooperate. The other agents had positioned themselves around the barn, their movements suggesting that they were prepared for resistance. "Mrs. Martinez, you don't understand the full scope of what you're dealing with," Agent Collins said, his voice carrying a hint of urgency. "Emma's abilities represent a quantum leap in human evolution. There are forces, both human and alien, that will stop at nothing to control or eliminate her. We can provide protection that you can't get anywhere else." Protection. The word carried both promise and threat. Sarah understood that Emma's abilities made her a target, but she also knew that those who claimed to offer protection often had their own agendas. The government program that Agent Collins represented would want to study her daughter, to understand her abilities, to potentially use her as a weapon against future alien incursions. "What do you want from us?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust those who claimed to have her best interests at heart. "We want to help Emma learn to control her abilities," Agent Collins replied, his tone suggesting that he was being honest despite the circumstances. "We have facilities and resources that can help her understand what she's become. We have other children like her, others who have been enhanced by alien technology. She wouldn't be alone. Other children like her." The revelation should have been comforting, but Sarah felt only horror. How many children had been subjected to the same integration process that had transformed Emma? How many families had been torn apart by alien abduction? The scope of the being's activities was far greater than she had imagined, and the government's response suggested that they had been dealing with such cases for years. "I want to see them," Emma said, her voice carrying the authority that had allowed her to control the alien craft. "I want to meet the other children. I want to understand what I've become." Sarah felt a stab of fear as she realized that Emma was considering the agent's offer. Her daughter's enhanced consciousness was driving her to seek understanding, to find others like herself who could help her comprehend the full extent of her abilities. But Sarah could see the dangers in such a course of action. Once Emma entered the government program, she would never be free to live a normal life. "Emma, we need to think about this," Sarah said, her voice carrying the concern of a mother who wanted to protect her child from forces she couldn't understand. "These people might not have your best interests at heart." "I know, Mommy," Emma replied, her eyes showing wisdom beyond her years. "But I can't control these abilities on my own. I need help, and they might be the only ones who can provide it." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of additional vehicles approaching the barn. Agent Collins spoke into his radio, his voice carrying urgency that suggested new developments. Sarah could see through the barn's windows that more agents were arriving, their numbers increasing, as if they were preparing for a confrontation. "We have company," Agent Collins announced, his professional demeanor shifting to one of concern. There are other groups tracking you, organizations that don't have your best interests at heart. We need to move now if we want to keep you safe. Other groups. Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized that they were caught between multiple forces, each with their own agenda for Emma's abilities. The government program that Agent Collins represented might be the lesser of several evils, but it was still a choice between different forms of captivity. What other groups? Dr. Reynolds asked, his clinical mind trying to understand the full scope of their situation. Private corporations, foreign governments, organizations that want to weaponize Emma's abilities, Agent Collins replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen the worst of human nature. The craft that took you was detected by multiple agencies. Everyone knows about Emma's abilities now, and they all want to control her. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Emma's dramatic display of power had been detected by organizations around the world, making her daughter a target for forces that operated outside the law. The government program might be their only hope for protection, but it would come at the cost of Emma's freedom and childhood. "I'll go with them," Emma said, her voice carrying the resignation of someone who understood that she had no real choice. "But I want the other families to be protected too. I want guarantees that they won't be hurt." Agent Collins nodded, his expression showing respect for Emma's mature decision-making. "We can arrange protection for all of you. Our program has resources that can help you adjust to your new circumstances." New circumstances. The phrase carried the weight of finality. Sarah understood that their old life was over, that they would never be able to return to the quiet existence they had known before their abduction. Emma's abilities had marked them all as participants in a conflict that spanned species and dimensions, and there was no going back to the ignorance they had once enjoyed. As they prepared to leave the barn, Sarah held Emma close, knowing that this might be their last moment of relative freedom. Once they entered the government program, they would become part of a system that operated by its own rules, answerable to authorities that the public would never know existed. Emma's abilities would be studied, analyzed, and potentially weaponized in ways that Sarah couldn't imagine. "I love you, sweetheart," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying all the emotion she felt for her daughter. "No matter what happens, no matter what they do to us, remember that you're still my little girl." Emma's response was immediate and heartfelt. "I love you too, Mommy, and I promise I'll use these abilities to protect people, not hurt them. I won't let them turn me into something I'm not." The words gave Sarah hope, but she knew that the forces they were about to face would test Emma's resolve in ways that neither of them could anticipate. The government program would want to shape her daughter's abilities according to their own agenda, and resisting that pressure would require strength that Sarah wasn't sure an 8-year-old possessed. As they walked toward the waiting vehicles, Sarah noticed that the other human captives were being separated into different groups. The adults were being taken to one location, while the children were being directed toward specialized facilities designed to handle their enhanced abilities. The program that Agent Collins represented was clearly extensive, with resources that suggested they had been dealing with such cases for years. "Will I see my mommy again?" Katie asked, her 6-year-old voice carrying the fear of a child who was being separated from her parent. "Yes, sweetheart," Agent Collins replied, his voice carrying the practiced reassurance of someone who had dealt with such situations before. "You'll see your parents regularly. We just need to help you learn to control your abilities before you can be reunited." Learn to control your abilities. The phrase carried implications that Sarah didn't like. The government program would want to train the children, to shape their abilities according to their own specifications. Emma and the other enhanced children would become weapons in a conflict that they didn't understand, their childhood sacrificed for the greater good of national security. As Sarah was helped into one of the vehicles, she caught a final glimpse of Emma being loaded into a specialized transport designed to contain her abilities. Her daughter's face showed determination, despite her exhaustion. the same resolve that had allowed her to resist the alien integration process. Emma would not surrender her humanity easily, but Sarah feared that the forces she was about to face would test her in ways that their alien captors never had. The vehicle pulled away from the barn, leaving behind the site of their brief freedom. Sarah watched through the window as the Pennsylvania countryside rolled past, knowing that she was seeing a world that she would never be able to return to. The beings had failed in their integration process, but they had succeeded in changing her and Emma in ways that would echo through generations. As they drove toward an uncertain future, Sarah held on to the memory of Emma's promise to use her abilities to protect people rather than hurt them. Her daughter had become something unprecedented in human history, a bridge between human and alien consciousness that could shape the future of both species. The question was whether the forces that now controlled her would allow her to fulfill that potential, or whether they would twist her abilities to serve their own agenda. The most disturbing part of their ordeal was not what the beings had done to them, but what humanity would do with the knowledge and abilities they had gained. The real test of their character would come not from resisting alien manipulation, but from maintaining their humanity in the face of their own species' capacity for exploitation and control. As the convoy of vehicles disappeared into the morning mist, Sarah knew that their story was far from over. The fight for Emma's soul had begun, and it would be waged not against alien invaders, but against the very people who claimed to be protecting them. The war for humanity's future had taken a new turn, and the outcome would depend on whether love could triumph over the forces that sought to weaponize the extraordinary abilities of a little girl who had stared into the abyss and refused to surrender her humanity. The convoy moved through the Pennsylvania countryside like a procession of shadows, their destination known only to Agent Collins and his superiors. Sarah sat in the back of the unmarked vehicle, her hands pressed against the bulletproof glass as she watched the familiar landscape disappear behind them. Each mile took them further from their old life, deeper into a world where her daughter's abilities would be studied, analyzed, and potentially exploited by forces she couldn't comprehend. Through the communication device still embedded in her palm, Sarah could sense Emma's presence in the specialized transport ahead of them. Her daughter's consciousness was a beacon of defiance in the growing darkness, her enhanced abilities creating ripples of interference that made the convoy's electronic systems flicker and spark. Even sedated and contained, Emma was fighting back against her captors with the same determination that had allowed her to turn the alien craft against its creators. "Your daughter is remarkable," Agent Collins said from the front seat, his voice carrying a mixture of professional admiration and genuine concern. "We've never encountered anyone with her level of psychokinetic ability. The readings from our monitoring equipment are off the charts." Sarah turned to face him, her eyes blazing with the protective fury that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her alien captivity. "She's not a test subject," she said, her voice carrying the authority of a mother who would not be intimidated. "She's an 8-year-old girl who has been through more trauma than most adults could survive. If your program hurts her in any way, I will make sure you regret it." The agent's expression didn't change, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes. He was assessing her threat level, trying to determine whether she possessed any of the enhanced abilities that her daughter had displayed. The communication device in her palm pulsed with warm energy, responding to her emotional state in ways that suggested her own consciousness had been altered by the alien technology. "Mrs. Martinez, I understand your concerns," Agent Collins replied, his tone carrying the practiced diplomacy of someone who had dealt with similar situations before. "But you need to understand that Emma's abilities make her a target for forces that operate outside the law. There are organizations that would kill to get their hands on her, and others that would eliminate her rather than allow her power to be used against them." The words sent ice through Sarah's veins. She had known that Emma's abilities would attract attention, but she hadn't fully grasped the scope of the danger they faced. Her daughter wasn't just a scientific curiosity. She was a potential weapon whose very existence threatened the balance of power between nations and species. "What kind of organizations?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Private military contractors, foreign intelligence agencies, corporations that specialize in weaponizing paranormal abilities," Agent Collins explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen the worst of human nature. "The craft that took you was detected by satellites belonging to at least 6 different nations. They all know about Emma's abilities now, and they all want to control her." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Emma's dramatic display of power had been witnessed by organizations around the world, making her daughter a target for forces that would stop at nothing to exploit her abilities. The government program that Agent Collins represented might be their only hope for protection, but it would come at the cost of Emma's freedom and childhood. As the convoy continued through the countryside, Sarah became aware of other vehicles joining their procession. Military transports, unmarked vans, and specialized equipment trucks were converging on their location from multiple directions. The operation to secure Emma and the other enhanced children was massive in scope, involving resources that suggested the government had been preparing for such a scenario for years. "How long have you been tracking cases like ours?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who was beginning to understand the true scope of the situation. "Since the 1940s, Agent Collins replied, his answer confirming Sarah's worst fears. "The beings you encountered aren't the first to visit Earth. We've been documenting alien encounters for decades, studying their technology, and preparing for the day when they would create enhanced humans like Emma." Decades. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. The government had known about alien abductions for generations, had been studying the beings' activities and preparing for their consequences. Emma and the other enhanced children weren't unique. They were part of a pattern that stretched back through history, a cycle of abduction and enhancement that had been hidden from the public for over half a century. "What happened to the others?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of the vehicle's engine. "The other children like Emma?" Agent Collins's expression darkened, and Sarah could see the weight of terrible knowledge in his eyes. "Some adapted to their abilities and became valuable assets to our program. Others couldn't handle the psychological pressure and had to be contained. A few simply disappeared, presumably taken by the beings for further experimentation." Contained. The word carried implications that Sarah didn't want to contemplate. The government program wasn't just about studying enhanced children. It was about controlling them, ensuring that their abilities couldn't be used against the interests of national security. Those who couldn't be controlled were eliminated or imprisoned, their extraordinary gifts becoming their death sentences. Through the communication device, Sarah felt Emma's awareness spike with alarm. Her daughter had been listening to the conversation, her enhanced consciousness allowing her to perceive threats that normal humans would miss. The 8-year-old was beginning to understand the true nature of the forces that now controlled her fate. "They're planning to separate us permanently." Emma's mental voice reached Sarah across the space between their vehicles. "They want to train me to be a weapon, to use my abilities against the beings and anyone else they consider a threat." The realization filled Sarah with a despair that was almost overwhelming. Her daughter would be raised in a facility designed to mold her into a tool for the government's agenda, her childhood sacrificed for the greater good of national security. The beings had failed to integrate Emma into their collective consciousness, but humanity would succeed in turning her into something equally inhuman. "I won't let them change me," Emma continued, her mental voice carrying the same determination that had allowed her to resist the alien integration process. "I'll use my abilities to protect people, not hurt them. I'll find a way to escape if I have to." Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. Emma's resolve was admirable, but she was still a child facing forces that had been perfecting their methods for decades. The government program would use every psychological and technological tool at their disposal to break her will and reshape her according to their specifications. The convoy began to slow as they approached their destination, a facility that appeared to be built into the side of a mountain. The structure was massive, its concrete walls rising from the earth like a fortress designed to withstand any assault. Guard towers dotted the perimeter, their searchlights sweeping the surrounding forest in endless patterns. This was where Emma would be taken, where her abilities would be studied and potentially weaponized. As they passed through multiple security checkpoints, Sarah caught glimpses of other enhanced individuals through the reinforced windows. Children and adults moved through the facility's corridors under heavy guard, their faces showing the hollow expression of those who had surrendered their humanity to forces beyond their control. Some displayed obvious signs of enhancement, their movements too quick, or their eyes too bright to be entirely human. Others appeared normal, until they demonstrated abilities that defied conventional physics. "This is where Emma will learn to control her abilities," Agent Collins explained as they approached the main entrance. "We have the best researchers in the world, facilities designed specifically for enhanced individuals, and other children like her who can help her understand what she's become." Sarah could see the clinical detachment in his voice, the way he spoke of her daughter as if she were a specimen to be studied rather than a child who needed love and protection. The government program would provide Emma with training and resources, but it would also strip away her humanity in the process, turning her into a weapon that could be deployed against any threat to national security. As they entered the facility, Sarah was separated from Emma for the first time since their escape from the alien craft. Her daughter was led away by specialists in protective gear, their movements suggesting that they were dealing with something potentially dangerous. The 8-year-old looked back at her mother with eyes that held both fear and determination, her enhanced consciousness already beginning to map the facility's layout and identify potential weaknesses. "When will I see her again?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking with the emotion of a mother being separated from her child. "That depends on how quickly she adapts to the program," Agent Collins replied, his tone carrying the practiced evasion of someone who had delivered similar news countless times before. "Some children adjust within months, while others require years of intensive training. Emma's abilities are particularly complex, so her integration period may be extended." Integration period. The phrase carried echoes of the alien procedures that had transformed Emma in the first place. The government program would use different methods, but the goal was the same: to reshape her consciousness according to their specifications, to turn her into something that served their agenda rather than her own humanity. Sarah was led to a debriefing room where she was questioned by a team of specialists about her experience aboard the alien craft. They wanted to know every detail of the being's procedures, their technology, their apparent goals and motivations. The questions continued for hours, each answer generating new inquiries that probed deeper into the horror of her captivity. The beings mentioned that their species was dying, one of the researchers noted, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who had discovered a crucial piece of information. They said they needed human consciousness to survive. This suggests that their abduction program serves a specific evolutionary purpose. Evolutionary purpose. The phrase made Sarah's blood run cold. The beings weren't just studying humans. They were trying to save themselves through the integration of human consciousness. Emma's abilities were the result of that process, a successful merger of human and alien intelligence that had created something unprecedented in the history of either species. "What does that mean for Emma?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the fear of a mother who was beginning to understand the true scope of her daughter's transformation. "It means she's not entirely human anymore," the researcher replied, his clinical tone doing nothing to soften the impact of his words. "Her consciousness has been fundamentally altered by alien technology, creating abilities that exist outside the normal parameters of human experience. She's become something new, something that bridges the gap between our species and theirs. Something new." The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she tried to process the implications. Emma wasn't just enhanced, she was a hybrid, a being that combined human emotion with alien intelligence. The government program would want to study that combination, to understand how it could be replicated and potentially weaponized. As the debriefing continued, Sarah became aware of activity throughout the facility. Alarms were sounding in distant corridors, and she could hear the sound of running footsteps and urgent communications. Something was happening, something that was causing the facility's staff to respond with obvious alarm. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, her maternal instincts telling her that the disturbance was connected to Emma. The researcher's expression darkened as he listened to reports coming through his earpiece. "Your daughter is demonstrating her abilities," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of fascination and concern. "She's interfacing with the facility's systems in ways that we didn't anticipate." Interfacing with the facility's systems, Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. Emma was fighting back against her captors, using her abilities to disrupt their operations just as she had done aboard the alien craft. The 8-year-old was refusing to surrender her humanity, even in the face of overwhelming institutional pressure. Through the communication device still embedded in her palm, Sarah could sense Emma's presence throughout the facility. Her daughter was learning to navigate the complex systems that controlled the installation, her enhanced consciousness adapting to human technology with the same ease she had shown with alien devices. The facility's computers were responding to her will, their programs reorganizing themselves according to her mental commands. "She's accessing classified databases," came urgent reports from the facility's security team. "Her consciousness is spreading through our entire network. We're losing control of essential systems." Losing control. The phrase carried implications that went far beyond simple technical difficulties. Emma's abilities were allowing her to penetrate the facility's most secure systems, to access information that was supposed to be protected by multiple layers of security. The government program that was supposed to control her was discovering that she was more powerful than they had anticipated. "Initiate containment protocols," ordered the lead researcher, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had dealt with similar situations before. "All enhanced subjects are to be sedated immediately. We cannot allow this disruption to continue." Containment protocols. Sarah felt her blood run cold as she realized what that meant. The facility was going into lockdown, its systems designed to prevent enhanced individuals from using their abilities to escape or resist their captors. Emma would be sedated, restrained, and subjected to procedures designed to break her will and force her to comply with the program's demands. "You can't do this to her," Sarah said, her voice blazing with the protective fury that had sustained her through the darkest moments of her alien captivity. "She's just a child. She doesn't understand what's happening to her." "She's not just a child anymore," the researcher replied, his clinical tone carrying the weight of someone who had seen the worst of human nature. "Her abilities make her a potential threat to national security. We have to contain her before she can cause irreparable damage to our operations." National security. The phrase had become a justification for any action, no matter how morally questionable. Emma's abilities were being seen as a weapon that could be used against the government's enemies, and her resistance was being interpreted as a threat that had to be eliminated. As the containment protocols activated, Sarah felt the communication device in her palm beginning to pulse with increasing intensity. Emma was fighting back against the sedation, her enhanced consciousness creating waves of psychokinetic energy that disrupted the facility's systems. The 8-year-old was using her abilities to protect herself, turning the government's own technology against them, just as she had done with the alien craft. "Systems failure in sectors 7 through 12, came reports from throughout the facility. "The subject is actively resisting containment. Her abilities are exceeding all previous measurements." Exceeding all previous measurements. Sarah felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. Emma was more powerful than anyone had anticipated, her abilities growing stronger as she learned to defend herself against her captors. The government program that was supposed to control her was discovering that she was beyond their ability to contain. Through the facility's intercom system, Sarah heard her daughter's voice echo through the corridors. The 8-year-old was using the communication systems to address the entire installation, her enhanced consciousness allowing her to overcome the technological barriers that were supposed to prevent such access. "I want to see my mommy," Emma's voice carried through the facility with impossible clarity. "I want to go home. I don't want to be a weapon. I just want to be a normal little girl." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Emma was still a child, still her little girl despite the extraordinary abilities that had transformed her consciousness. The government program saw her as a potential weapon, but she was still motivated by the simple desire to be with her mother and live a normal life. "Please," Emma continued, her voice carrying the authority that had allowed her to control alien technology. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want to be left alone. Let me and my mummy go home." The facility's response was immediate and overwhelming. Security teams moved through the corridors with weapons designed to neutralize enhanced individuals, their movements coordinated by specialists who had been trained to deal with such situations. They were treating Emma like a dangerous criminal rather than a traumatized child, their actions driven by fear of abilities they couldn't understand or control. "She's accessing the external communication systems," reported the facility's technical team. "She's trying to broadcast her location to outside agencies. We need to shut down all outgoing transmissions immediately." Outside agencies. Sarah realized that Emma was trying to call for help, to reach people who might be able to rescue them from the government program that held them captive. Her daughter's enhanced consciousness was allowing her to penetrate security systems that were supposed to be impregnable, to send messages to organizations that might be willing to help them escape. But even as Emma fought back against her captors, Sarah could sense the strain that her abilities were placing on her young system. The 8-year-old was pushing herself beyond her limits, using power that her developing mind and body weren't designed to handle. The government program might not be able to contain her, but her own abilities might destroy her from within. "Emma, stop!" Sarah called out, her voice carrying through the facility's communication systems. "You're hurting yourself. Please, sweetheart, you need to rest." Her daughter's response was immediate and heartbreaking. "I can't stop, Mommy. They want to turn me into something I'm not. They want to make me hurt people. I have to fight back." The words revealed the true horror of their situation. Emma understood what the government program intended to do to her, knew that she was being groomed to become a weapon against her own species. Her resistance wasn't just about escaping. It was about maintaining her humanity in the face of forces that wanted to strip it away. As the facility's containment protocols intensified, Sarah felt the communication device in her palm beginning to burn with psychokinetic energy. Emma was channeling her abilities through their connection, using her mother's presence as an anchor to maintain her sanity in the face of overwhelming institutional pressure. The 8-year-old was drawing strength from their bond, using love as a weapon against those who sought to control her. "All personnel evacuate sectors 1 through 15, came urgent announcements throughout the facility. "The subject has achieved critical mass. Her abilities are destabilizing the facility's structural integrity." Critical mass. The phrase carried implications that Sarah didn't want to contemplate. Emma's abilities were growing beyond all previous measurements, her consciousness expanding to encompass systems and technologies that should have been beyond human comprehension. The government program that was supposed to control her was discovering that she was more powerful than they had ever imagined. Through the facility's security cameras, Sarah watched as Emma's containment chamber began to dissolve around her. The 8-year-old was using her abilities to break down the molecular structure of the walls themselves, turning the government's most secure facility into a prison that could no longer hold her. Her daughter was achieving the impossible, using love and determination to overcome technology that had been designed to contain beings with extraordinary abilities. "Facility evacuation in progress," announced the intercom system. "All personnel report to emergency stations. The subject has breached containment and is actively destabilizing the installation." Breached containment. Sarah felt a surge of hope as she realized that Emma was fighting her way free from the forces that sought to control her. The 8-year-old was using her abilities to escape from the government program, to reclaim her freedom and her humanity from those who saw her as nothing more than a weapon to be wielded. But even as Emma fought back against her captors, Sarah could sense that the conflict was far from over. The government program was just one of many forces that wanted to control her daughter's abilities, and their escape would only mark the beginning of a larger struggle. The world beyond the facility's walls was filled with organizations that would stop at nothing to exploit Emma's power, and their fight for freedom would be waged against enemies that operated outside the law. As alarms blared throughout the facility and emergency protocols activated, Sarah held onto the communication device in her palm, feeling Emma's presence growing stronger with each passing moment. Her daughter was coming for her, using abilities that defied human understanding to tear through the barriers that separated them. The 8-year-old who had started this journey as a normal child was now something unprecedented in human history, a being whose consciousness bridged the gap between species and dimensions. The most disturbing part of their ordeal was not what had been done to them, but what they had become in the process of fighting back. Emma was no longer entirely human, her consciousness altered by alien technology in ways that would echo through generations. But she was still her mother's daughter, still motivated by love and the desire to protect those she cared about. As the facility shook around them and emergency teams scrambled to respond to the unprecedented crisis, Sarah knew that their story was entering a new chapter. The government program that had sought to control Emma was discovering that some forces could not be contained, that the human spirit combined with extraordinary abilities could overcome even the most sophisticated attempts at control. The war for humanity's future had taken another turn, and the outcome would depend on whether love and determination could triumph over the forces that sought to weaponize the extraordinary gifts of a little girl who had stared into the abyss and emerged with the power to reshape reality itself. The battle for Emma's soul was far from over, but she had proven that even the most powerful institutions could not break the bond between a mother and her child. In the darkness of the collapsing facility, Sarah held on to hope, knowing that Emma was fighting her way back to her with abilities that no prison could contain. The most disturbing alien abduction in history had created something unprecedented, and the world would never be the same. But as long as love endured, as long as the human spirit refused to surrender, there was still hope for a future where extraordinary abilities could be used to protect rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, and Sarah's heart leaped as she recognized the familiar rhythm. Emma was coming for her, using powers that defied comprehension to tear through the barriers that separated them. The 8-year-old who had saved them all from their alien captors was about to save them again, this time from the very people who claimed to be protecting them. As the wall of the debriefing room began to shimmer and dissolve, Sarah saw her daughter's face appear through the dissolving matter, her eyes blazing with the same determination that had allowed her to resist alien integration. Emma had come to take her home, to reclaim their freedom from forces that sought to control them both. The most disturbing alien abduction in history was about to become the most remarkable escape, as love and determination triumphed over the forces that sought to weaponize the extraordinary gifts of a child who refused to surrender her humanity. The facility shook one final time, and then Emma stepped through the dissolving wall, her small hand extended toward her mother. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, united by bonds that no technology could break and no institution could sever. The fight for their freedom had begun, and it would be waged with weapons that no enemy could understand or defeat. The power of love, the strength of family, and the indomitable spirit of a little girl who had discovered that the most extraordinary abilities meant nothing without the humanity to guide them. As mother and daughter embraced in the ruins of the facility that had sought to contain them, Sarah knew that their story was far from over. But whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, armed with abilities that could reshape the world and the love that made them worth fighting for. The most disturbing alien abduction in history had become the most beautiful story of redemption, as humanity's greatest strength proved more powerful than any technology or institution designed to control it. The battle for the future had begun, and love had already won the first victory.